Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into one of the most powerful and, frankly, most misunderstood instruments in all of modern finance, the financial swap. They're an absolute cornerstone of the global economy, but they also hide some incredible risks.
Sounds like an exaggeration, right? But that's pretty much what happened. Back in 2008, a certain type of swap played a starring role in the global financial meltdown. So what are these things, and how could they be both an essential tool for big business and a potential weapon of mass financial destruction?
All right, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get the basic idea. Then, we'll look at the common types you see every day. After that, we'll get into the risky, high-stakes side of things. We'll see how regulators stepped in. And finally, we'll understand why swaps are, believe it or not, more relevant than ever.
Okay, let's jump right in. At its heart, what is a financial swap? What are we even talking about?
So, first off, it's a private agreement. That means you won't find it on a public stock exchange. It's what they call over-the-counter, or OTC. And in this contract, two parties just agree to swap future payments. Now, the key phrase here is notional principal. Think of it as a reference number, let's say $1 million, that's used only to do the math. The actual $1 million, it usually never even changes hands.
And because they're private, these OTC deals are incredibly flexible. You can customize the terms for really specific situations. Usually, the setup is pretty simple. One side pays a fixed, predictable amount, while the other side pays a variable or floating amount. And that floating payment changes based on some outside benchmark, like an interest rate or the price of oil. So, now that we've got the basic idea down, let's see how this actually works in the real world. Let's look at the most common types of swaps, which are basically the power tools of corporate finance.
Okay, the most common one by far is the interest rate swap. It's exactly what it sounds like. Two parties swap interest payments. One side pays a steady, fixed rate. The other pays a floating rate that moves up and down with the market benchmark, like SOFR, which is a really important global benchmark for interest rates. So why on earth would anyone do this? Well, imagine a company took out a big loan, but the interest rate on it is variable. Their monthly payment could just jump up at any time, which makes budgeting a nightmare. So, to manage that risk, they can enter into a swap. They agree to pay a bank a fixed rate. In return, the bank pays them the floating rate. That floating payment they get from the bank cancels out their floating loan payment. And just like that, the company has a stable, predictable expense. It's actually a pretty brilliant way to create certainty.
And we're not talking about a small, niche market here. The scale of this is, well, it's just staggering. As of April 2022, the notional value, that reference amount we talked about, for these swaps was over $5 trillion. This is a massive, essential part of our global financial plumbing. Now, currency swaps are a little different, and here's the key thing to remember. The principal amounts, say US dollars and euros, are actually exchanged right at the beginning of the deal. Then after a set period of making interest payments to each other, they swap those original principal amounts right back at the same initial rate. A big reason to do this is to get access to better borrowing rates in a foreign currency. And, this same basic logic applies to commodities. Think about an airline. One of its biggest, most unpredictable costs is jet fuel. So, by using a commodity swap, they can lock in a fixed price for fuel for the next year. It protects them from wild swings in the oil market and makes their financial planning a whole lot easier. So this table really pulls it all together. It's like having different tools for different jobs. Whether you're trying to manage risk from interest rates, currencies, or commodities, there's a swap designed for it. You can even use an equity swap to get the financial return of owning a stock without ever actually buying it. The main point is, they are incredibly versatile. So far, swaps sound like pretty sensible tools for managing risk, right? But here's the twist. Any powerful tool can be used in other ways. And that brings us to the high-stakes gambling side of the market. And this is probably the most important distinction we need to make today. It all comes down to intent. Hedging is when you use a swap to protect yourself from a risk you already have, like that airline with its fuel costs. Speculating is when you use the exact same swap just to make a bet. You don't have any underlying risk. You are purely gambling on whether prices or rates will go up or down. Which brings us to the most infamous swap of all, the Credit Default Swap, or CDS. Now, in theory, it's a smart idea. It's supposed to work like an insurance policy. If you own a company's bond and you're worried they might go bankrupt, you can buy a CDS. You pay regular premiums, and if that company defaults, the seller of the CDS pays you back. Simple.
But that's not really how they ended up being used. As Cornell Law School points out, these things were right at the heart of the 2008 financial crisis. So why? The answer is speculation.
This is where it gets crazy. People who didn't even own the bonds started buying and selling CDS contracts on them. It was literally like buying fire insurance on your neighbor's house. You have no connection to it, you're just betting it's going to burn down so you can collect the payout. When the U.S. housing market started to crumble, these bets created a catastrophic chain reaction that sent shockwaves through the entire global financial system.
And the danger wasn't just in CDS. A huge problem in this private OTC market is something called counterparty risk. What does that mean? Well, it's the risk that the person on the other side of your deal goes bankrupt and just can't pay you what they owe you. Before 2008, this risk connected everyone in a massive, fragile, and invisible web.
The 2008 crisis was a brutal, brutal lesson. It forced regulators all over the world to confront the dangers that were lurking in the shadows of this OTC market, and essentially to write a brand new rulebook from scratch.
You have to remember, before 2008, this market was almost totally dark. It was private and opaque. The crisis threw a spotlight on the massive systemic risk that created. So in response, the U.S. passed the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, and Europe followed with its own set of rules a couple of years later called EMIR.
Now, these new laws, Dodd-Frank in the U.S. and EMIR in Europe, they were really all about one thing: transparency. They wanted to drag this market out into the sunlight. The U.S. pushed for swaps to be traded on public platforms, kind of like a stock market. The EU required every single trade to be reported to a central database. The shared goal was to reduce that dangerous counterparty risk and prevent one big failure from taking down the whole system.
So where does all of this leave us today? Have the new rules fixed everything? Is the problem solved?
Well, the big takeaway here is that swaps are still very much a double-edged sword. On one hand, they are absolutely essential for global companies to manage their day-to-day financial risks. And yes, the new rules have made the market way more transparent and safer. But on the other hand, these are still incredibly powerful and complex instruments that demand constant, careful oversight.
And that really leaves us with a critical question for the future. And not just for bankers, but for all of us. Financial innovation is never going to stop. There will always be a new idea, a new instrument. So the real ongoing challenge is to figure out how to harness the benefits of that innovation without letting the hidden risks threaten the stability of our entire economic system.